The boardroom of the Harmon Hotel Group had floor-to-ceiling windows on the eastern wall, and on the morning of my 71st birthday, I sat at the far end of the long conference table and watched the sunrise come through those windows and thought about all the sunrises I had watched from that same chair over the previous 30 years. My son-in-law Marcus Webb sat at the opposite end of the table, in the chair I had occupied for 3 decades, the chair that had been mine since the morning we moved into this building in 1991. He was 44 years old, tanned from a recent golf trip, dressed in the kind of suit that announces itself without apology, and he was looking at me with an expression I had learned, over the preceding 18 months, to read with the same precision I once read weather systems over mountain passes, an expression that combined manufactured sympathy with something colder underneath, the look of a man who has decided he is waiting you out. Beside him sat my daughter Diane. My daughter who had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness and who had, in the 5 years since she married Marcus Webb, become slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly less like herself and more like a person standing slightly behind someone else. The other board members, 6 of them, 4 of whom Marcus had installed over the preceding 2 years, sat along the sides of the table, their faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality that I had learned to read as complicity. Marcus slid a document down the table. It stopped in front of me. "We think this is the best path forward, Edward," he said, using the full name he had recently adopted in place of the Ed that everyone who actually knew me used. "Given the recent concerns about cognitive clarity, a voluntary transition of executive authority seems like the most dignified option for everyone." Cognitive clarity. That was the phrase he had chosen. That was the particular weapon he had spent 18 months building and deploying and testing in rooms I was not in. I looked at the document. I looked at my daughter, who was looking at her hands. I looked at the 6 board members, none of whom would meet my eyes. I looked at Marcus, who was meeting my eyes with the specific quality of a man who has decided the outcome is already determined and is simply managing the formalities. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and placed a small USB drive on the table. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, keeping my voice at the same level and pace I had used for 40 years of meetings, "I'd like to play a recording." The expression on Marcus Webb's face changed. "Before I tell you what was on that recording, and how my late wife Catherine saved everything we built together from beyond the grave, let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And if you have ever had someone try to convince the world that you were losing your mind when you were sharper than you had ever been, subscribe to the Steady Father and hit that like button, because this story is for you." To understand the recording, you have to go back 4 years. And to understand those 4 years, you have to understand who Catherine was, and what she saw in Marcus Webb long before I was willing to see it. I built my first hotel in 1974. I use the word built deliberately, because I did not purchase a going concern or inherit a family business or acquire a franchise. I built it, with the same quality of physical labor that the word implies, working alongside the contractors I hired for the renovation of a failing 8-room motel on a state highway outside the city, swinging a hammer and pulling wire and laying subfloor on the weekends because I could not afford to pay for the labor I was doing myself. The motel had been built in the 1950s, in the optimistic roadside vernacular of that era, and had spent the subsequent 20 years accumulating the specific shabbiness of a property that has been managed without investment and occupied without pride. I bought it from a man who was tired of it, for $42,000 that I had saved over 6 years of working in hotel management for other people, learning the business from the inside with the specific intention of eventually owning a piece of it myself. Catherine had been working the front desk of the largest hotel in our city when I met her in 1969, a hospitality job she had taken after finishing a business degree at the State University because hotel management seemed to her like the intersection of several things she was interested in: organization, people, the specific challenge of creating an experience out of the ordinary materials of rooms and service and attention. She was 22 years old, and she understood hotels in a way I had not yet fully developed at 24, with an instinct for what a guest actually needed that went considerably beyond the technical competencies I had been accumulating. We married in 1971. We bought the motel in 1974. We spent our first full year of ownership working 17-hour days, Catherine managing the front operations and guest experience while I managed the physical plant and the renovation budget, each of us learning the half of the business the other had come to more naturally, until the distinction blurred and we both understood all of it. By 1980, we had bought a second property. By 1990, we had 6. By 2010, the Harmon Hotel Group comprised 14 boutique hotels in 7 states, with a reputation for the specific quality of hospitality that comes from properties that are individually designed, personally managed, and staffed by people who understand that a guest's experience is the product of 1,000 small decisions made correctly rather than a handful of large ones made expensively. We were not the biggest hospitality company in our market. We had never tried to be. We were the best in the specific niche we had identified and cultivated for 40 years, which is a considerably more durable position than size, and we had built it without ever compromising the standard that Catherine had articulated on the morning we opened the first renovated motel for business. Every guest should leave feeling that they were cared for specifically, not generally. That standard was the company. Not the properties, not the brand, not the revenue, the standard. Remove it and you have 14 buildings generating income. Maintain it and you have something that cannot be replicated by people who did not build it, regardless of how much money they have or how convincing their business credentials appear. Marcus Webb's credentials, as I would eventually discover, were considerably less convincing than they appeared. But I am getting ahead of myself. Catherine Harmon, née Ellison, was the kind of person whose absence from a room is immediately detectable, not because she was dramatic or loud or demanding of attention, but because she brought to every space she occupied a quality of engaged, genuine interest that you do not fully register as a distinct thing until it is gone. She remembered everything about everyone she met. Not in the performed way of people who have been taught that remembering names is a professional skill, but in the natural way of someone who was genuinely interested in the people she encountered and found the details of their lives worth retaining because they were worth retaining, because the people who provided the details were worth knowing. She had opinions that were precise and well-reasoned and delivered with a directness that occasionally startled people who had expected something softer from a woman of her generation and presentation. She was not aggressive. She was simply clear, and clarity in a person who also has warmth is a rare and powerful combination. She was the best business partner I ever had, which is also the same as saying she was the best partner I ever had, because over 40 years of building the company together the two categories had become entirely fused. She was diagnosed with a stroke in the spring of 2022, on a Tuesday morning when she was doing something entirely ordinary, reading at the kitchen table, coffee beside her, the specific domestic scene of a woman in her 70s who has arranged her mornings to include the things she loves most. She survived the initial event but not the complications that followed over the subsequent 6 weeks, and she died on a Thursday in early June with Diane and me on either side of her hospital bed and the same quality of dignified composure she had brought to everything else in her life, right up until the end. She had not told me, before she died, about the recording. She had not told me about the second attorney. She had not told me about the amendment to her portion of the family trust. She had, I would come to understand, made the decision to handle these things quietly and independently, without burdening me with knowledge I would not yet need, because Catherine had always been a woman who planned for contingencies and who understood that the value of a backup plan lies in its preservation until the moment it is actually required. She had been planning for the contingency of Marcus Webb for 3 years before she died. She had simply not told me she was doing it, because she had not yet needed to, and because she knew, as I did not, as I would not fully understand until considerably later, that the day would come. Marcus Webb came into our lives in 2017, when Diane brought him to a family dinner with the specific manner of a woman who has already made a decision and is introducing it for acceptance rather than consideration. He was 39 years old, handsome in the way that takes effort and investment, with the smooth, calibrated social ease of a man who had spent his adult life learning to make favorable first impressions. He had, according to his own account, an MBA from a business school I did not immediately recognize and a background in hospitality consulting that encompassed several notable hotel groups in the Northeast. He spoke about hospitality with the particular fluency of someone who has absorbed the vocabulary of an industry without necessarily having inhabited it at any depth, a distinction I recognized professionally but did not, in that first dinner, allow myself to act on, because Diane was looking at him with a quality of happiness I had not seen on her face in several years, and I was not inclined to undermine it with professional skepticism. Catherine was more skeptical. She told me so afterward, in the kitchen, while I was washing up and she was drying the dishes in the specific companionable rhythm of 40 years of shared evenings. "He's very polished," she said. "He seems competent," I said. "Polished and competent aren't the same thing, Ed. He clearly knows the industry." "He knows the language of the industry," she said. "That's not the same thing either." I had heard this particular distinction from Catherine before, applied to various candidates and partners over the years, and I had learned that when she drew it, she was usually right. But I had also learned that her particular sensitivity to the difference between performed and actual competence occasionally led her to write off people who turned out to be genuinely capable, and so I had developed the habit of holding her early assessments lightly while observing whether time confirmed or contradicted them. Time, in the case of Marcus Webb, confirmed them comprehensively, though considerably more expensively than I had anticipated. Diane and Marcus were married in 2019, in a ceremony at one of our hotels that was tasteful and warm and attended by 300 people, and I walked my daughter down the aisle with the specific mixture of joy and anxiety that I imagine accompanies every father performing that particular act, and I shook Marcus's hand at the altar with genuine goodwill. Catherine shook his hand with a smile that reached precisely as far as it needed to and no further. I noticed this at the time. I told myself it was the normal ambivalence of a mother whose daughter was marrying someone new. I was wrong, but I was not yet ready to be right about it. Marcus joined the Harmon Hotel Group officially in 2020, a year after the wedding, in the role of Chief Strategy Officer, a title we had not previously had, designed specifically for him, that Diane had advocated for with the specific energy of a woman who wants her husband to succeed in her family's company and believes that creating the right structural position is the first step toward enabling that success. I had agreed to the arrangement with reservations I expressed to Catherine privately and did not press publicly, because Diane's happiness and her stake in the company were both real considerations, and because I was willing to be proven wrong in my reservations if the work warranted it. Marcus was good at certain things, I will say that clearly. He was good at presentations, at the creation of visually compelling strategic documents that summarize complex situations elegantly and propose solutions with the clean decisiveness of someone who has learned that confidence, in a board setting, is frequently mistaken for competence. He was good at the specific social performance of executive leadership, at walking through a hotel property with the authoritative air of a man who knows what he is looking at speaking to staff in the language of empowerment that had become the standard vocabulary of contemporary management. He was not good at the underlying substance of what he was presenting. The strategies he proposed were frequently derivative, assembled from industry publications and conference presentations, repackaged with enough modification to avoid direct attribution but not enough genuine development to constitute original thinking. The property assessments he delivered in his authoritative walkthroughs reflected a surface reading that missed the structural and operational details that decades of experience had taught me to find immediately. I saw these deficiencies, and I corrected the strategies and the assessments in the quiet, collaborative way of someone who is trying to develop a person rather than embarrass them. I gave Marcus credit for the frameworks he offered while redirecting the conclusions. I did not draw explicit attention to the errors in his analysis, because he was my son-in-law and my daughter loved him and I was choosing, as I had chosen in my early assessment of him, to allow time and performance to tell the story rather than my own judgment. What I did not see, during those first 2 years, was what Marcus was doing with my corrections. He was cataloging them. He was keeping a record of every instance in which I had redirected his analysis or adjusted his conclusions, and he was presenting this record, in rooms I was not in, as evidence of something other than what it was. He was telling board members and senior staff that he had observed, in multiple recent interactions, that my judgment was showing signs of inconsistency. That I was repeating myself in meetings. That I had forgotten conversations that had occurred days earlier. That I had, on one occasion, called him by the wrong name. He was, carefully and methodically, building a narrative about my cognitive decline. And he was building it in exactly the venues where such a narrative could do the most damage, in private conversations with board members, in concerned asides to senior hotel managers, in worried discussions with Diane that framed his observations as expressions of love and concern rather than strategic positioning. Catherine found out about it in 2021. She did not tell me. I know what Catherine knew, and when she knew it, and what she did about it, because she left me a letter. Not the recording, I will get to the recording, but a letter, handwritten on her personal stationery in the careful, precise penmanship she had maintained all her life, sealed in an envelope and placed inside a document she filed with her second attorney, with instructions for its delivery at the appropriate time. The letter told me that she had become aware, in the autumn of 2021, that Marcus was conducting what she described as a systematic campaign to undermine your standing with the people who work with you and depend on you. She had learned this from two sources, a longtime hotel manager named Gloria Chen, who had worked with us for 22 years and who had come to Catherine privately with what she had witnessed in a board dinner she had attended in a service capacity, and from a junior board member named Thomas Park, who had been troubled enough by what Marcus was saying in private conversations that he had sought out Catherine to share his concerns. Catherine had not told me about either of these conversations, because she had been, by the time they occurred, already beginning to show the early warning signs of the stroke that would take her the following year, not dramatically, not in ways that were immediately recognizable as medical rather than simply the variable energy of a woman in her mid-70s. But in ways that she herself had recognized and that had caused her to begin, with the systematic forward planning that had always characterized her approach to risk, to put things in order. She had consulted a second attorney, a woman named Patricia Wells who practiced estate law in a city 2 hours away, specifically because she did not want the documents prepared through our regular estate attorney, whose firm had done work for Marcus's personal finances and whose loyalty she was no longer certain of. She had amended her portion of the family trust, restructuring the ownership and succession provisions in ways that Marcus would not anticipate and that would significantly complicate any plan to take operational control of the Harmon Hotel Group through Diane's shares. And she had kept the recording. The recording had come first, actually, before the attorney and the letter in the amended trust. It had come from the hotel security system in the conference room of our flagship property, which automatically recorded all meetings held in the space as a standard liability protection measure that we had implemented years earlier and that I had, frankly, mostly forgotten about. Marcus had used that conference room, in March of 2020, for a meeting with a hospitality consultant named Derek Saunders who he had engaged privately, outside company channels, to assess the Harmon Hotel Group's portfolio and advise on its restructuring potential. He had used the conference room because it was convenient and because he had not, apparently, been aware that the recording system was active. Catherine had discovered the recording during a routine review of the hotel's security logs, something she did periodically, a habit from our early years when liability protection required personal attention, and had watched it and had known, immediately, that she was looking at something she needed to preserve. She had copied it to a USB drive. She had put the USB drive in the letter envelope, along with a note explaining what it was. She had given the envelope to Patricia Wells with instructions to hold it until either she requested its return or, in the event of her death, to deliver it to me directly and confidentially. Patricia Wells had delivered the envelope to me 6 months after Catherine's death, on a morning when I was sitting in my home office trying to understand why 3 of our hotel managers had, in the preceding month, been quietly replaced by people I did not recognize and had not approved for hire. I had opened the envelope. I had read Catherine's letter. I had held the USB drive in my hand for a long time. Then I had called the only attorney I knew that Marcus had no connection to. I am going to tell you what was on the recording, but I want to prepare you for it the way Catherine's letter prepared me, not by softening what it contains, but by placing it in the context of what it means to hear a person you have trusted with your daughter and your business and your family's future speak about you and your life's work in the way Marcus spoke about them on that March afternoon in 2020. The recording was 94 minutes long. I have watched it many times now, enough times that certain phrases have become fixed in my memory the way the most important things always become fixed, available for recall without effort. Marcus had arranged the meeting with Derek Saunders, the consultant, to discuss what he called the transition pathway for the Harmon Hotel Group. Saunders was a restructuring specialist who had worked with several hospitality companies on what the industry euphemistically called generational transitions, a phrase that covers a broad range of situations, from legitimate succession planning to the kind of engineered displacement that Marcus appeared to have in mind. In the first 20 minutes of the recording, Marcus outlined his assessment of the company's portfolio, its market position, and what he described as its operational ceiling under existing leadership. His assessment was not entirely wrong in its observations. He identified several genuine inefficiencies and market gaps accurately enough, but the conclusions he drew from those observations were shaped by a motivation that became clearer as the recording progressed. At the 23-minute mark, Saunders asked directly about the timeline for any transition. Marcus said, and I will quote this as precisely as my memory allows, "The old man's health is going to be the variable. Catherine's already fading, she doesn't have the sharpness she used to have, and she won't be a factor in another year, maybe two. Edward is physically fine, but he's showing the early signs of cognitive drift. I've been documenting it for 6 months. Repeated conversations, minor confusion in meetings, a couple of name errors. Nothing dramatic yet, but enough to build a picture over time if I'm consistent about it." Saunders asked, "Is the cognitive thing real or are you building the narrative?" Marcus said, "Both, a little. He's 70 years old. He's not as sharp as he was. I'm helping people see what's already there." I have watched that exchange many times. Each time, the phrase lands with the same quality of cold impact. I am helping people see what's already there. The casual precision of it. The complete absence of any apparent recognition that what he was describing was not the observation of a genuine decline but the deliberate construction of a false one, using the natural variabilities of aging as raw material for a manufactured case. The recording continued. Saunders asked about Diane. Marcus said, "Diane is manageable. She loves her father, but she trusts me more. I've been consistent about framing my concerns as coming from a place of love and worry. By the time this moves forward, she'll believe she's protecting him, not losing him. That's important. I need her emotional energy pointed in the right direction. I will not tell you what I felt when I heard those words about my daughter. I will simply tell you that I sat in my home office for a long time afterward, and that the piece of the recording that has stayed with me most persistently, that I return to most often when I am trying to understand fully what was done to my family, is not the part about me. It is the part about Diane. He had been managing my daughter's emotional reality for years, calibrating her perceptions of me to serve his purposes, using her love for her father as an instrument of the plan he had been executing since at least 2020. Diane had not been his accomplice. She had been, in the most painful possible sense, his most important tool. The attorney I called, after reading Catherine's letter and watching the recording 3 times, was a man named Richard Holt, 63 years old, who had spent 30 years in commercial litigation and who had been recommended to me by a business acquaintance who described him as the person you want when someone is trying to take something that belongs to you and has been careful about how they did it. Richard Holt's office was in a building 6 blocks from our flagship hotel, a coincidence of geography that felt slightly surreal when I first walked into it, aware that I was a few minutes from the conference room where a recording of my son-in-law planning my displacement was waiting on a USB drive in my jacket pocket. I sat across from Richard Holt and I told him the full story, from Marcus's arrival in our lives through Catherine's letter and the recording and the 3 hotel managers who had been replaced without my knowledge. I placed the USB drive on his desk. I described the amended trust, which Patricia Wells had also provided documentation of, and which I had spent 2 evenings reading with the specific combination of legal dictionary and professional context that 40 years of contract review had given me. Richard Holt listened without interrupting, which was the first thing that told me I had chosen correctly, because the ability to receive a full account without the need to demonstrate your own processing of it is a professional skill that not every attorney possesses. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The recording is your anchor. Everything else, the false dementia narrative, the unauthorized hirings, the consulting engagement he ran without board disclosure, all of it is more damaging in the presence of the recording because the recording establishes intent. Without it, each individual action has a plausible innocent explanation. With it, the pattern becomes visible." "What about the embezzlement?" I asked. He looked at me. "What embezzlement?" I told him about the financial irregularities I had found in the past 3 weeks, since receiving Catherine's letter and beginning to look at the company's books with the attention I had not given them during the period when I had been trusting Marcus with operations. I had not called them embezzlement yet. I had called them irregularities, anomalies, expenses I could not source to approved projects, but Richard Holt's question had clarified for me that what I was describing was a word I had been avoiding. "Show me the numbers," he said. The financial irregularities I had discovered in 3 weeks of personal review were, when Richard Holt's forensic accountant spent 2 weeks examining the company's books in full, considerably more extensive than I had yet found. The total was $2.8 million, moved out of the company over 30 months through a combination of methods that Marcus had evidently believed were sufficiently disguised by their variety to resist detection. He had used vendor invoices from companies that, on examination, either did not exist or existed only on paper, established for the purpose. He had used a consulting fee structure that processed payments to an entity called Web Strategic Advisors LLC, which was registered in a state with minimal disclosure requirements and was, as Richard's investigators confirmed within a week, beneficially owned by Marcus Webb through a nominee structure. He had used expense reimbursements that exceeded the activities they supposedly covered by margins that had been kept individually small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny but that aggregated, over 30 months, to amounts that were visible in the total picture. He had been careful. He was not a financial expert, and the methods he had used reflected someone who had educated himself in the mechanics of concealment from publicly available sources rather than from professional experience, which meant the concealment was thorough enough to survive casual review but not rigorous enough to survive the kind of systematic forensic examination that a trained accountant with full access to the records could bring to bear. The $2.8 million was, in the context of the company's total revenue over the same period, a percentage that was significant but not immediately catastrophic. What made it meaningful was not the amount alone but what it revealed about what Marcus had intended to do with the company once he had obtained operational control of it. Richard's accountant found, in the records of Web Strategic Advisors LLC, a series of payments to a hospitality investment group based out of state. Following those payments led to a set of documents that Richard's investigator obtained through a process I did not fully understand but that Richard assured me was both legal and routine. The documents were letters of intent, dated the previous year, in which Marcus Webb, acting in his capacity as Chief Strategy Officer of the Harmon Hotel Group, had discussed the potential sale of 4 of our 14 hotel properties to the investment group at a price that was, Richard's real estate consultant confirmed, approximately 30% below their market value. Marcus had not been planning simply to take over the company. He had been planning to sell pieces of it, at discounted prices that would generate buyers willing to move quickly and without the scrutiny that a fair market transaction would attract, and to pocket the difference through structures that the $2.8 million in preliminary embezzlement was presumably intended to help establish and obscure. He had been planning to dismantle Catherine's standard, the thing that was actually the company, and sell the remaining buildings and brand at a price that reflected their value as real estate rather than their value as the specific expression of 40 years of a particular kind of hospitality that could not be replicated by the people who would be acquiring them. He had been planning to do this with Diane's shares, in a company that bore her parents' name, using the operational authority he had been building for 5 years through a combination of manufactured credentials, patient positioning, and the deliberate destruction of my standing with the people who should have been my protection against exactly this. I sat with that picture for the length of time it took Richard Holt to pour 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on his conference table and set one in front of me. Then I looked at him and said, "How do we end this?" Richard Holt was methodical in a way that reminded me of Catherine, which was the quality I most required in a person I was trusting to help me dismantle a structure that had been built with considerable care and patience. He did not rush. He built the case the way I had built hotels, from the foundation up, with attention to every detail, trusting that a structure built correctly would hold against anything applied to it. We spent 6 weeks in preparation, during which I maintained the performance of my normal life at the company with a completeness that required everything I had learned over 71 years about the relationship between internal experience and external presentation. I attended board meetings and strategy sessions and property reviews. I engaged with Marcus in the mild, deferential manner of a man who has begun to accept that his time has passed and is making a graceful accommodation to the judgment of others. I allowed him to redirect conversations I had initiated and to summarize my contributions in terms slightly different from what I had said and to position himself, in every room we shared, as the person managing a difficult situation with the patient professionalism it deserved. He believed it. He believed it because he had been building the narrative of my decline for 18 months and the narrative had confirmed itself often enough, in enough rooms with enough people, that he had stopped questioning its accuracy and started treating it as established fact. This is the specific danger of a well-constructed false narrative. It eventually becomes self-sustaining, requiring less active maintenance as it accumulates its own apparent confirmations, and the person maintaining it begins to relax the vigilance that was necessary in its construction because the construction appears complete. Marcus had relaxed. He had scheduled the birthday meeting, my 71st birthday, the date he had chosen with a calculation I could not determine but that had a theatrical quality I recognized as characteristic, and he had circulated a draft of the voluntary transition document to the board members whose support he believed he had secured, and he had told Diane. In the conversation she reported to me afterward with the specific quality of a woman who was repeating something that had troubled her more than. She had initially allowed herself to admit that the timing felt right and the kindest thing was to make the transition as smooth as possible for your father. She had reported this to me 3 days before the birthday meeting, during a dinner at her house that Marcus had attended and that I had used to do 2 things, reassure Diane that I was fine, and observe Marcus in the relaxed manner of a man who believes his plan is about to be executed and is managing the final emotional variables. He was good at the management, I will give him that. He was warm to Diane and solicitous of me and careful about the specific quality of concern he performed in my direction, the concern of a man who genuinely hates what he is doing but feels he has no choice. It was a good performance. If I had not been sitting across from a man whose voice I had heard on a recording saying that he was helping people see what was already there, I might have been moved by it. I was not moved by it. I was noting every detail of it for the record I was building in my own mind, and I was thinking about the USB drive in the locked drawer of my home office, and I was thinking about Catherine. I want to tell you about Gloria Chin, because she is the part of this story that most clearly demonstrates what Catherine meant when she said that the standard was the company. Gloria had been managing our original hotel, the one built from the 1950s motel, our flagship property that we had renovated 3 times over 50 years, since 2001. She had come to us from a competing property as a front desk manager and had, over the following 22 years, become the human embodiment of the Harmon Hotel Group standard in its most concentrated form. She knew every regular guest. She knew the preferences of the staff and the peculiarities of the building and the specific ways in which our guests' expectations had evolved over the decades and the specific ways in which those expectations needed to be met. She was 61 years old, and Marcus had flagged her, in the board meetings I had attended over the preceding year, as a legacy management asset who would need to be evaluated for fit in the evolving strategic context, phrases I had learned to translate from the specific vocabulary of corporate restructuring, as meaning that he intended to replace her. Gloria had been the one who told Catherine what she had witnessed at the board dinner, in 2021. She had come to Catherine rather than to me because, she told me later, she had not been certain how I would receive the information and had been more certain that Catherine would know what to do with it. This was, I thought, an accurate assessment of our relative dispositions at the time, and also a testimony to the specific trust that a 22-year working relationship can build. She came to my office 6 days before the birthday meeting, during a morning when I had asked her to stop by under the pretext of a routine discussion about a property upgrade. She sat across from my desk with the specific composure of a woman who has been waiting a long time to have a conversation she was not certain she would ever be permitted to have. I told her what I knew. I told her about Catherine's letter and the recording in Richard Holt and the 6 weeks of preparation. I watched her face move through a sequence of reactions, recognition, relief, something close to grief for what the company had been put through, and then settle into a focused, purposeful stillness. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you to be in the room on my birthday," I said. "I need you to be a witness." She nodded once, firmly, in the way of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to be asked of them and is glad to have the waiting over. "I'll be there," she said. The hardest conversation of the entire 6 weeks was the one I had with my daughter 4 days before the birthday meeting. I had debated, for the full duration of the preparation, whether to tell Diane in advance or whether to allow the meeting itself to be her revelation. Richard Holt had argued, on practical grounds, that informing her in advance risked the information reaching Marcus and compromising the meeting's effectiveness. On the other hand, allowing her to discover in a boardroom, in front of 6 board members and a hotel general manager, that her husband had spent years systematically deceiving her about both me and his own intentions, this seemed, from the perspective of a father who still, despite everything, wanted to protect his daughter, unnecessarily brutal. I chose the middle path that Catherine's letter, in its final paragraph, had suggested: tell Diane the essential truth, that Marcus had been dishonest, that the birthday meeting was not what he had represented it as, and that I needed her to come with an open mind rather than a prepared position, without showing her the recording or the full financial picture until she had the strength of the meeting's context to hold them in. The conversation lasted 2 hours. We sat in Diane's kitchen, in the house she had bought with Marcus 5 years earlier, with cups of tea neither of us drank, and I told my daughter what her mother had known and what I now knew and what I needed her to be willing to believe before we walked into that boardroom together. She did not react the way I had feared she would. She was not defensive of Marcus, or disbelieving of me, or angry that I had waited this long. She was quiet for a very long time, and then she said something that told me, more clearly than anything else she could have said, how much of what Marcus had done had already registered in some part of her that she had not permitted herself to consciously acknowledge. "I've been feeling like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize," she said. "For about 3 years now. I kept telling myself it was just adjusting. Marriage adjusts you. But it felt like something was being asked of me that I wasn't sure was fair to give." I put my hand over hers on the table. "Your mother knew," I said. "She protected you the only way she could, from where she was." Diane looked at me with her mother's eyes, and the grief and the anger that crossed her face were real and unmixed with performance, and I understood, looking at my daughter in that moment, that whatever happened in the boardroom in 4 days, she was going to be all right. She was Catherine's daughter, and she was my daughter, and she was going to be all right. On the morning of my 71st birthday, I dressed in the suit I wore for the most important meetings of my career, dark charcoal, white shirt, a tie Catherine had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary, a deep blue silk that she had described as the color of someone who has already decided. I had never been sure exactly what she meant by that, but I had worn it to every significant professional encounter in the years since, and it had never let me down. I arrived at the boardroom 20 minutes early and placed the USB drive on the table in front of my chair, not visibly but accessible, within reach for the moment I would need it. Gloria Chen arrived 18 minutes early and took a seat along the wall, in the position she had taken for 22 years at meetings where she attended in an observational capacity, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with the calm of a person who is fully prepared for what is coming. Diane arrived 15 minutes early. She sat 2 seats to my right, equidistant from my chair and the chair where Marcus would sit, and she looked at the table and nodded at me, and I understood from this that she was managing the same quality of internal experience that I was managing, the specific discipline of a person who is holding a great deal very carefully and cannot afford to let any of it show prematurely. Richard Holt arrived 10 minutes early, with a woman I had not met before who turned out to be the county prosecutor's liaison, a young attorney named Sarah Okafor, whose presence in the room was the element of the morning's preparation that I had been most specific about requiring. I wanted a legal authority in that room when the recording played, not as a threat but as a witness whose presence could not be explained away afterward as anything other than what it was. Marcus arrived at exactly the scheduled time, which was his habit, punctual to the minute as an expression of professional discipline, never early, which might suggest eagerness, never late, which might suggest disrespect. He saw the room and processed it visually in the way he always processed rooms, a quick scan that he had trained himself to make appear casual but that I had always recognized as inventory. He saw Gloria. His expression did not change significantly, but something shifted behind it, a minor recalibration. He saw Richard Holt. The recalibration became more visible, a fractional tightening around the eyes. He saw Sarah Okafor. He stopped moving for approximately half a second before he completed his entry into the room and took the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had been mine for 30 years. He placed the transition document on the table. He looked at me with the expression I have already described, manufactured sympathy over something considerably colder, and he said the words about cognitive clarity. I reached into my jacket pocket. I placed the USB drive on the table. Before anyone signs anything, I said, I'd like to play a recording. The silence that followed was of a specific quality I had encountered before, in the years I spent in rooms where large amounts of money were in question and the question had just resolved itself in a direction that not everyone present had anticipated. It is a silence that is not empty but densely populated with the sound of people processing revised calculations at high speed. Marcus looked at the USB drive. He looked at Richard Holt. He looked at Sarah Okafor. He looked, finally, at me, and in that look I saw the moment when the false narrative of my cognitive decline encountered the reality of what I had actually been doing for the past 6 weeks, and I watched it collapse in real time behind his eyes. Richard Holt stood, retrieved the USB drive, and connected it to the conference room's presentation system. The recording began. I had watched it many times. I knew every word. But there is a difference between knowing every word of something and being in a room where it plays in front of the people it implicates, and the difference is instructive. The board members who had been Marcus's installations, 4 of them, who had received his private presentations about my declining capacity and who had agreed to support the transition document, heard their absent conversations referenced in terms that made the private nature of what they had been told suddenly, fully visible. The consultations they had believed were confidential professional concerns expressed by a worried son-in-law were now audible to the full room as elements of a constructed narrative rather than a genuine one. I watched Diane listen to the recording. She had been prepared for it, but preparation is not the same as experience, and the experience of hearing her husband describe her as manageable and her emotional response to her father's situation as something to be pointed in the right direction, she absorbed it with the stillness of a woman who is holding the full weight of something without letting it move her prematurely, and I saw, watching my daughter in that moment, exactly who she was. She was Catherine's daughter. She was absolutely, perfectly, heartbreakingly Catherine's daughter. Marcus said nothing during the recording. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the screen and did not speak, and the quality of his silence shifted, over the 94 minutes, from the calculated silence of a man managing a situation to the hollow silence of a man who has understood that there is nothing left to manage. When the recording ended, Richard Holt stood again. He placed 3 documents on the table in front of Marcus. The first was a summary of the financial forensic findings, prepared by his accountant, itemizing $2.8 million in unauthorized disbursements. The second was the documentation from Patricia Wells's office regarding Catherine's trust amendment and the succession provisions that it established, which entirely removed Marcus from any path to operational control of the company regardless of what Diane's shares might otherwise have permitted. The third was a letter from Sarah Okafor's office, the county prosecutor's liaison, formally notifying Marcus that his financial conduct was under criminal investigation for fraud. The transition document on this table, Richard said, is void of any legal effect, as it was presented under false pretenses and in the context of an ongoing fraud. Mr. Webb, I would recommend that you contact your personal attorney before making any further statements in this room. Marcus looked at me one final time across the length of that conference table. I do not know exactly what he was looking for. Whatever it was, I do not think he found it. Marcus left the boardroom without a word, which was, in its own way, a final expression of the quality that had characterized him throughout, the understanding that the moment for performance had passed and that silence was the only remaining form of control available. His attorney contacted Richard Holt within the hour. The criminal investigation proceeded over the following months with the bureaucratic methodical pace that legal processes require, and Marcus ultimately entered a plea agreement that included full financial restitution, forfeiture of any claim on the company in any capacity, and a suspended sentence contingent on complete repayment of the $2.8 million over a structured schedule. He did not serve prison time, which I had mixed feelings about and ultimately made peace with, because the restoration of what had been taken was the outcome I had sought, and the criminal process had delivered that outcome even if it had not delivered every consequence I might have considered appropriate. The 4 board members Marcus had installed resigned within 2 weeks of the meeting, some proactively and some following private conversations with Richard Holt that I was not present for and did not need to be. I replaced them with people who had been with the company long enough to understand what the company actually was, including Thomas Park, the junior board member who had gone to Catherine 3 years earlier, and a woman named Evelyn Moore who had managed our Chicago property for 15 years and who had the specific understanding of the Harmon standard that I wanted represented at the board level. Gloria Chen remained in her position as general manager of the flagship property, and received, at the first board meeting of the new structure, a recognition that she accepted with the same dignified composure she brought to every aspect of her work. The 4 hotel properties that Marcus had been in preliminary discussions about selling were retained. The letters of intent were voided. The Hospitality Investment Group received a letter from Richard Holt's office explaining that the parties who had initiated the discussions had lacked the authority to do so, and that the company had no interest in proceeding with any aspect of those discussions. They did not contest this. The $2.8 million in restitution was, as it was recovered through the structured repayment schedule, transferred back into the company's operations fund and used specifically for the renovation and maintenance of the 3 properties that had been most neglected during the period when Marcus's financial extractions had been depleting the capital that should have gone to their upkeep. My relationship with Diane in the months that followed the boardroom meeting was the aspect of the outcome that required the most patience and the most care, because it was the aspect that could not be resolved by legal process or financial restitution but only by the slow, necessary work of 2 people re-establishing the truth of their relationship after a significant period in which that truth had been obscured. She filed for divorce within 6 weeks of the meeting. The process was, given the criminal proceedings running parallel to it, complicated, and I will not detail it beyond saying that she had an excellent attorney and that the outcome, when it came, was fair by every measure that mattered to her, which are the only measures that needed to matter to me. What I can tell you is that the Diane who came through the divorce and the preceding months of reckoning was more recognizably herself than the woman I had been watching become less and less herself over the preceding 5 years. The quality she had always had, her mother's precise opinions delivered with her father's directness, returned gradually but completely, the way a property returns to itself when it has been restored to the care of someone who understands what it should be. She came back to the company in a formal capacity 8 months after the boardroom meeting, joining the board in a role that was her own, not inherited from a marital connection but created from her own understanding of the business she had grown up watching her parents build. She was 44 years old and had, by the time she took her seat at the board table, a clarity about what the company was and what it should remain that I recognized as the product of having nearly watched it be destroyed. We did not talk about Marcus more than the situation required. There was a conversation, one Saturday afternoon, when she came to my house for the specific purpose of having it, when she sat at the kitchen table where I still drink my morning coffee, and she said, "I want you to know that I saw things I didn't let myself see. I want you to know I'm sorry I didn't look harder." I told her that what she had not seen was what Marcus had deliberately hidden from her, calibrated specifically to her blind spots, and that this was not a failure of her intelligence or her love but simply the predictable consequence of being close to a person who has made a systematic study of your specific vulnerabilities. She said, "Mom saw it." Mom saw it, I agreed. She saw a lot of things early. It was one of her most useful qualities. Diane smiled, the first time I had seen that specific smile in what felt like years, the smile that was entirely Catherine's. She used to say you never listened to her early enough. She was right, I said. I almost always got there eventually, though. Eventually, Diane said. Eventually was enough. I think about what Catherine did, the second attorney, the amended trust, the preserved recording, the letter written against the contingency of a situation she hoped would not materialize but was not willing to leave unaddressed, in the context of everything she was managing in the period when she did it. She was in the early stages of the physiological decline that would take her within a year. She was running a major business. She was watching her son-in-law dismantle her husband's professional standing in rooms she was not always strong enough to attend. She was, simultaneously, trying to ensure that her departure from the world would leave the people she loved in the best possible position to navigate whatever came after. And she was doing it quietly, without burdening me with the full picture, because she had made a judgment that I was not yet in a position to receive the information usefully, that the 6 weeks of preparation I was able to conduct with the information, after her death, after Patricia Wells delivered the envelope, was more valuable than the longer period I would have had if she had told me during her lifetime, because in the longer period I would have been tempted to move too early, before the evidence was complete, and in moving too early I would have lost the element of surprise that was ultimately the critical advantage. She was right. She was right in the specific way she had always been right about the things I was inclined to rush, which was the way of someone who understood both the situation and the person she was working with and calibrated her intervention accordingly. I have, since her death, returned many times to the question of whether I adequately understood, while she was alive, the full scope of what she brought to our partnership. The honest answer is that I understood it well, better than I might have if she had been less consistently present in my life, because the consistency created the habit of appreciation as well as the habit of dependence, but that I could not have understood it completely until I experienced its absence. The recording, the attorney, the amended trust, the letter, these were not extraordinary departures from Catherine's character. They were entirely characteristic of her. They were exactly what I should have expected she would do if she became aware of a threat to something she valued. They were the standard applied, as she had always applied it, to the people and places she cared about most. The recording was her gift to me. Not because it resolved the situation, I could, with enough time and investigation, have assembled the evidence without it, but because it was her voice, her judgment, her eye for the thing that mattered and her instinct for preserving it, still operating after she was gone, still protecting what we had built together, still looking after the people she had loved. I keep the USB drive in my desk, in the same locked drawer where I found it. I am not sure I will ever need to watch the recording again. But I will not throw it away, because it is Catherine's, and because the specific quality of care embedded in it, the care of a person who prepared for the future she hoped would not be necessary while making sure she would be present in it if it was, is something I want to remain in contact with, even now. A year after the boardroom meeting on my 71st birthday, I stood in the lobby of our flagship hotel on a Wednesday morning in autumn and watched the day's first guests arrive. The lobby of that hotel had been redesigned 3 times over the 50 years of its operation, each redesign responsive to the changing aesthetics and expectations of hospitality without ever losing the fundamental quality that Catherine had articulated on the morning we first opened it for business. A guest should feel, from the moment they walk through the door, that someone is glad they came. This is not a design principle. It cannot be expressed in tile choices or lighting specifications or lobby furniture. It is expressed entirely through people, through the person behind the desk who looks up before the guest reaches the desk, through the quality of attention in the greeting, through the small noticing of a preference mentioned once and remembered without being asked about again. Gloria was at the front desk, which was not her normal position but which she returned to periodically, specifically on mornings when she wanted to take the temperature of the thing she had been managing for 22 years. I watched her greet the first arriving guest, a woman traveling alone with a rolling suitcase and the specific expression of someone who has been in transit since early morning and is arriving at the point of her journey that she had been looking forward to most. I watched Gloria notice the expression and respond to it, not with the scripted warmth of trained hospitality but with the genuine warmth of a person who has spent 22 years caring about the people who come through these doors, and who therefore does not need to perform caring because the caring is actual. The guest's expression changed. It changed in the specific way it changes when someone in a state of travel-worn weariness is received with genuine attention, shifting from the braced quality of someone managing an unknown situation to the relieved quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they are actually welcome. That was the standard. That was what Catherine had meant. That was the thing Marcus had been planning to sell at 30% below market value to a hospitality investment group that would have replaced it with a performance of hospitality rather than the thing itself, and the difference, if you were watching as carefully as I was watching that morning, is entirely visible. I stood in the lobby for a while longer, watching the morning proceed, and then I took the elevator to my office and began the day's work. I had a board meeting in the afternoon and a property review in the morning and a conversation with the architect who was designing the renovation of our newest acquisition, a small hotel in the Pacific Northwest that needed the same quality of attention the original motel had needed in 1974. The architect was 29 years old and technically excellent and had not yet fully developed the instinct for what a building is trying to be as opposed to what can be imposed on it, and I was looking forward to the conversation because teaching is one of the things that has always made the work feel like more than work. I was 71 years old, and I was building things. The company was stable and well managed and staffed by people who understood the standard. My daughter was on the board and increasingly confident in the role she had made genuinely her own. Gloria Chen was in the lobby greeting the morning's arrivals. Catherine's trust amendment was in the company's founding documents, an invisible but permanent part of its structure. And on my desk, in the locked drawer, was a USB drive that contained 94 minutes of a man revealing everything he intended to do and none of the things he actually accomplished, and a letter from my wife that I had read enough times now to know by heart, and that ended with the same instructions she had given me from her hospice bed, in the language of 48 years of a particular kind of partnership. Keep the standard. Don't let anyone take what we built. I haven't. I won't. That is the steady thing, the thing that holds. That is the steady father. There is a word in hospitality, and in construction, and in any craft that involves making something that people will inhabit, that does not get used enough in the contexts that deserve it. The word is standard, and what I mean by it is not a metric or a benchmark or a target, all of which are approximations of the thing, but the actual thing, a clear and non-negotiable understanding of what good means, internalized deeply enough that it operates automatically, without requiring constant enforcement or articulation. Catherine had the standard before I fully did. She had it from the beginning, from the morning she stood at the front desk of someone else's hotel and understood, at 22, what the experience of a guest should feel like and what it meant when it didn't. She brought it to the motel we bought and the company we built and the 50 years of decisions we made together, and it is in the DNA of every property that carries our name in the specific, invisible way that the most important things are always present in the DNA of the things we build, not visible on the surface, but determining everything about how they hold. Marcus did not understand this. He understood revenue and market positioning and strategic frameworks and the language of hospitality. He did not understand the standard, which is why he was able to look at the Harmon Hotel Group and see 14 buildings generating income that could be reorganized for a better return, rather than seeing what it actually was, 48 years of a particular quality of care made physical, made permanent, made available to the people who come through the doors of those 14 buildings looking for exactly the thing we built them to provide. You cannot take a standard. You can take the buildings and the brand and the revenue. You cannot take the thing that makes people glad they came, because the thing that makes people glad they came lives in the people who learned it and practice it and teach it to the next person, and it is not transferable through a transaction. Marcus tried to take it. He failed, as any person who attempts to take such a thing must ultimately fail, because what he was trying to acquire was precisely the element that could not survive the acquisition. The standard is still there. It is in Gloria's greeting this morning and in the renovation drawing on my desk and in Diane's voice in board meetings when she speaks about a property decision with the specific combination of precision and warmth that is entirely her mother's and entirely her own. It is in the 11 people I have interviewed this year for positions across our properties, and in the 4 I hired because they had it and the 7 I did not hire because they had the language of it without the thing itself, which is the same distinction Catherine drew on the evening after she met Marcus Webb. It is in the piece of me that woke up from heart surgery, in the other story, the one my friend built, and knew what had been taken and knew how to take it back, and in the piece of me that watched Marcus Webb walk out of that boardroom and felt not triumph but simply the specific relief of a restored structure, something returned to its right form after the wrong force had been applied to it. We are the steady ones. We who built things honestly and defended them without losing ourselves in the defense and returned to the building afterward because the building is what we are. This is not a heroic thing. It is a practical thing, the product of learning over a long time what holds and what doesn't, what is worth defending and how to defend it without becoming something unrecognizable in the process. The hotels are full tonight. The standard is intact. Catherine is gone and her gift is still here, still working, still keeping the things she loved safe in the specific way she always kept things safe, quietly, completely, with the long view and the careful preparation of someone who understood that the best protection is the one nobody needs to see until the moment it is needed. I turned off the light in my office at 6 o'clock and walked through the lobby on my way out, and Gloria was still there, handing a room key to a couple who had just arrived. And I heard her say something that made them both laugh, a small, spontaneous thing, the kind of moment that is not trained but earned, and I walked out through the lobby doors into the evening feeling, as I have felt every evening I have left that building for 50 years, like a man who built something worth coming back to. I want to tell you about the night we opened the original motel for the first time as a Harmon property, because it is the clearest image I have of who Catherine and I were at the beginning of what we were building together, and because understanding the beginning makes the rest of the story make the kind of sense that purely financial descriptions cannot. We had been renovating for 8 months. The renovation had cost more than the purchase, which was not surprising given the state of the building, and it had consumed every hour of our lives outside the day jobs we were both still working to fund it, Catherine at the hotel front desk, me swinging a hammer every evening and every weekend and every vacation day I could accumulate. We had hired 2 contractors for the work we couldn't do ourselves and had supervised them with the obsessive attention of people who cannot afford to have anything done wrong and who therefore verify everything personally. The night before opening, we worked until 2 in the morning finishing the last details, touch-up painting in 3 rooms, a curtain rod that had been installed fractionally crooked and that Catherine had identified from the doorway with an eye that I had already learned was calibrated to fractions of an inch. We fixed the curtain rod at 1:15 in the morning, standing on a step ladder in room 7, and when it was straight we stepped back and looked at the room and at each other. "Are we ready?" I asked. "We're ready," she said. Not with bravado, not with performed confidence. With the specific certainty of someone who has checked everything that can be checked and knows the condition of every element and is prepared to be accountable for all of it. We had 8 rooms. We had 3 bookings for opening night. We had a breakfast service that Catherine had designed and that I had built the serving area for in the week before opening, a simple buffet arrangement that she had made elegant with the specific skill she had for creating dignity out of modest materials. The 3 guests who arrived on opening night were a traveling salesman, a couple driving from one coast to the other and needing a midpoint rest, and a woman visiting her sister in the city who couldn't afford the downtown hotels. None of them were glamorous guests. None of them arrived with expectations that exceeded the modest nature of the property. What they found was a room that was clean and maintained to a standard that exceeded what the price point typically delivered in that era and in that market, and a breakfast the following morning that was better than they had anticipated, served by a woman who asked each of them how they had slept and actually listened to the answer. None of them knew that the woman serving breakfast had also painted 2 of the guest rooms the previous week and had worked until 2 in the morning on a curtain rod the night before. They did not need to know. What they knew was that someone cared whether they had slept well, and that the answer mattered. That was the standard. On the first morning we applied it. It was the same standard we applied on every subsequent morning for the next 50 years, in 14 properties across 7 states. And it was the same standard that Gloria Chen applied on the Wednesday morning I stood in our flagship lobby and watched her make a travel-worn woman feel genuinely welcome. You cannot acquire a standard through a corporate transaction. You can only build it, over a long time, from the inside. I want to be honest about what I knew about Marcus and when I knew it, because honesty about this is the only way to make the story useful rather than simply satisfying. I knew something was wrong with Marcus Webb within 18 months of his joining the company, and I did not act on what I knew for another 3 years after that. This is not a gap that makes me feel good about my own judgment, and I do not present it to you as something other than what it was, a failure to trust the instinct I had developed over a career of watching people perform competence versus actually possessing it, because the stakes of the conclusion felt too high and the personal costs of being right felt too significant. The first thing I knew was that his credentials were thinner than they appeared. The MBA from a business school I hadn't immediately recognized turned out, when I looked into it more carefully, to be from an institution that existed primarily as a credential generator rather than an educational entity, the kind of school that, in the hospitality industry's formal training pathways, is not considered equivalent to a degree from an accredited program. I found this out within a year of his joining the company, during a casual conversation with a colleague at an industry conference who mentioned, in an entirely different context, that he had encountered an applicant from the same institution and had been surprised to learn what it actually was. I did not confront Marcus about this. I told myself it was possible he had genuinely not understood the difference when he enrolled, that he had pursued the credential in good faith and had supplemented the formal gap with genuine practical learning. This was possible. It was also convenient, and I have enough honesty left to acknowledge that the convenience was a factor in how readily I accepted the possibility. The second thing I knew was that the consulting background he had described, several notable hotel groups in the Northeast, was described in terms that resisted specific verification. When I made discreet inquiries through colleagues at 2 of the groups he had mentioned, I received responses that were careful and nonspecific in a way that suggested the relationship had been more peripheral than his description implied. Not absent entirely, he had evidently been present in both organizations in some consulting capacity, but not the substantial operational role his self-presentation suggested. Again, I did not confront this directly. I adjusted my assessment of his actual competence and gave him appropriate oversight accordingly, framing the oversight to him as collaboration, and I continued. What I did not do was what Catherine was doing simultaneously, actively investigating, documenting, preparing. I was managing the situation within the daily operations of the company. Catherine was looking at it from a greater distance and seeing its full shape, and the full shape was something I was not ready to see. I have asked myself many times since why I was not ready. The most honest answer I have arrived at is that Marcus was my daughter's husband, and the conclusion I would have been required to draw from what I knew, that my daughter had married someone whose professional identity was substantially constructed rather than earned, and who was deploying that constructed identity in my company with intentions I did not yet fully understand, was a conclusion that had too many downstream implications for too many people I loved for me to approach it directly. While the evidence was still partial, Catherine did not have the same resistance, because Catherine had never been sentimental about professional assessment. She brought to people the same light she brought to buildings, not what she wanted them to be, but what they actually were. It was one of the qualities I most admired in her and one of the qualities I was least able to replicate, because my admiration for it coexisted with a temperament that was, by comparison, considerably more inclined toward the benefit of the doubt. The benefit of the doubt, in the case of Marcus Webb, was expensive. I am at peace with having paid the cost, because the recovery was complete and the education was genuine, and at 71 years old, a genuine education is not something I can afford to be ungrateful for simply because it arrived at cost. Thomas Park had been on the Harmon Hotel Group's board for 4 years when Marcus arrived, appointed at Catherine's suggestion after a chance meeting at an industry event where he had demonstrated, in the space of a single conversation, that rare combination of financial literacy and genuine hospitality instinct that we had always looked for in board members. He was 38 years old when all of this happened, which made him the youngest member of the board by a significant margin, and his relative youth had been, in the preceding 2 years, a source of mild social difficulty in the board dynamic, because Marcus had positioned himself as the forward-looking voice of the next generation and had used Thomas's youth and relative inexperience as a subtle mechanism for dismissing his contributions in precisely the moments when those contributions were most relevant. Thomas had come to Catherine, rather than to me or to the full board, because he was not yet certain of his own reading of the situation and was not willing to make a formal allegation against a board colleague on the basis of what might have been his own misinterpretation of private conversations. He was careful in exactly the way that the situation required carefulness, and he had identified Catherine as the right person to receive the information because he trusted her judgment and because he understood, instinctively, that the question of what to do with what he had observed was above the level of certainty he currently possessed. He had observed Marcus, over the course of 3 separate private conversations at board dinners and 1 property visit, characterizing my engagement with recent board discussions in terms that were subtly but consistently more confused and less sharp than my actual engagement had been. He had not witnessed anything dramatic, no explicit fabrication, no obviously false claim. He had witnessed a pattern of gentle, consistent reframing that, taken individually, each instance could be attributed to a difference of interpretation or a selective memory. Taken together, across 3 different occasions with 3 different board members, the pattern was something else. Catherine had thanked him, asked him to document what he had observed as specifically as possible, and told him she would handle the rest. He did not know about the recording or the second attorney. Catherine had not told him, and she had been correct not to, because the specific information needed to be controlled until the moment it could be deployed with full effect. Thomas's role was to be a credible witness to what he had observed directly, and the value of that witness was in its independence from the larger picture, which Thomas's not knowing the larger picture preserved. When I brought Thomas into the preparation, 6 weeks before the birthday meeting, and showed him the recording and told him what Catherine had done and what Richard Holt was preparing, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "She knew the whole time." "She knew from the moment you told her," I said. "Probably before, actually. She just didn't have the recording yet when you spoke to her." He thought about this. "She never let on." "No," I said. "She was very good at that." He nodded slowly, with the respectful acknowledgement of a younger person recognizing a quality in an older one that they aspire to but have not yet fully developed. She protected you without you knowing she was protecting you. That's what she did, I said. For 48 years. Patricia Wells was 60 years old, a sole practitioner with an estate law practice she had run independently for 25 years after leaving a larger firm to escape the specific atmosphere of large firm practice that, she had told her colleagues at the time, made it impossible to give any single client the quality of attention the work deserved. She had met Catherine through a professional women's organization they had both belonged to for years, a connection that had never been directly professional but that had, over a long period of occasional lunches and annual events, developed into the specific variety of trust that grows between two people of similar disposition and complementary experience who enjoy each other's company. When Catherine called her in the autumn of 2021, 3 months after the conversation with Thomas Park, and asked whether she would be willing to prepare an amendment to an estate trust document with the specific requirement that the engagement remain entirely confidential and that no communications be addressed to her home, Patricia had asked one question: is this about protecting yourself or protecting someone else? Both, Catherine said. Mostly someone else. Patricia had agreed without further qualification, which was the response of a person who understood the situation from that single exchange and did not need it explained in detail. The trust amendment Catherine instructed her to prepare was technically complex but conceptually simple. It restructured the succession provisions of Catherine's half of the family trust in ways that specified, with considerable precision, the conditions under which Diane's shares could be exercised in company governance. The key provision established that a supermajority of board members with tenures predating any specific management appointment could override decisions made under any power granted by those shares, specifically in circumstances where a formal fraud investigation was underway. In plain terms, if Marcus used Diane's shares to take operational control of the company, and if that control was subsequently found to have been exercised in connection with fraud against the company or its founders, the board members who had been there before him could reverse it. It was not a perfect legal mechanism. Richard Holt identified several ways it could have been challenged in court, but it did not need to be perfect. It needed to be visible, present, and disruptive enough to Marcus's plans that the disclosure of its existence changed his calculation. Which it did. In the boardroom, when Richard Holt placed the document in front of him and Marcus understood that the structure he had spent 5 years building had a load-bearing wall he had not known about. Catherine had put the wall there. She had done it from her own knowledge of what was coming, and from her own understanding of what the wall needed to be, and she had done it quietly enough that it remained in place until the moment it was needed, undisturbed and unrevealed. I think about this sometimes in the context of the hotels, of the buildings we had spent 50 years constructing and maintaining. The load-bearing walls are the invisible ones. They are not the ones that guests see or that the design draws attention to. They are the ones that hold everything up from inside the structure, the ones that you only appreciate fully when something tries to push hard against them and they don't move. Catherine was a load-bearing wall. In the building of our family and our company and our life together, she was the invisible structure that held everything up from inside, and when Marcus tried to push hard against what we had built, she didn't move. There is a hotel in our portfolio that almost wasn't ours. I want to tell you about it because it is the clearest illustration I have of why Marcus's plan to sell 4 properties at 30% below market value was not merely a financial crime but an aesthetic one, a destruction of something that could not be rebuilt by the people who would have acquired it. The hotel is in Vermont, a white clapboard building that was originally built as a country inn in 1887 and that we acquired in 2003 from a family who had owned it for 3 generations and who were selling because the 3rd generation had moved away and the 2nd generation was aging and neither had the resources to maintain it properly. It was in good structural condition but needed significant interior renovation, and it had the specific quality of a property that has been loved rather than managed, personal and idiosyncratic in ways that a chain hotel would have been unable to replicate. Catherine had found it, as she found most of the properties we acquired, through a network of contacts she had cultivated over decades of industry engagement. She had driven up to see it alone before she told me about it, specifically because she wanted to form her own opinion uncontaminated by mine, and when she came back she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Ed, there is a building in Vermont that has been waiting for us." I had never heard her use language quite like that about a property. I had heard her describe properties as promising, undervalued, well-located, structurally sound, interestingly positioned. I had never heard her say a building had been waiting for us, as though the relationship between a building and its owners was reciprocal rather than transactional. I drove up to Vermont the following weekend. I understood within 20 minutes of walking through the front door what she had meant. The building had a quality of accumulated hospitality that I had never quite encountered in another property, a physical presence that felt genuinely welcoming in a way that had nothing to do with its decor or its amenities and everything to do with the specific quality of care that had been given to it over 116 years. It had been loved by people who understood what a place of welcome should be, and the love had become part of the structure, visible in the way that anything genuinely cared for becomes visible in the quality of itself. We bought it. We renovated the interiors with the specific intention of serving what was already there rather than imposing a new character on top of it. We hired a manager for it who had grown up in Vermont and who had, within the first month of her tenure, memorized the names and preferences of every regular guest and who brought to the property the same quality of genuinely warm attention that Catherine had identified, in 1974, as the standard. The Vermont property was one of the 4 that Marcus had been in preliminary discussions about selling. I do not know whether the hospitality investment group that would have acquired it would have maintained what it was. I suspect they would not from malice but from the simple impossibility of acquiring, through a transaction, the thing that makes a place what it actually is. They would have acquired the building and the brand and the revenue stream, and they would have managed it competently. And it would have been a perfectly adequate country inn in Vermont for guests who had no prior experience of it and therefore no basis for comparison. But it would not have been what it was. The guests who came back year after year because of the specific quality of welcome they received there would have stopped coming back, not all at once but gradually, as the thing that had brought them there was replaced by something that resembled it from the outside without being it from the inside. And the thing itself, the accumulated hospitality of a building that had been cared for genuinely for over 100 years and that we had carried forward for 20 more, would simply be gone. You cannot reconstruct it once it is gone. That is the specific violence of what Marcus was planning to do, and it is the violence I am least able to be entirely philosophical about, even now that everything has been restored. The Vermont property is still ours. The manager is still there. The guests who come back year after year are still coming back. The building has been waiting for all of them, as Catherine told me it had been waiting for us, and it continues to provide the specific welcome that a building genuinely loved by the people responsible for it is capable of providing. That is what we were defending. That is what Catherine's gift defended. That is what the steady father is about. Diane's children, my grandchildren, Oliver and Margot, are 15 and 12 years old respectively, and they have grown up, as children in hospitality families tend to grow up, knowing that the hotels are there and that the hotels are in some sense a part of who their family is, without yet fully understanding what that means or what it cost. They knew, as children know things that adults communicate through behavior rather than explicit instruction, that the hotels were important to Grandma Catherine in a way that went beyond employment or financial interest. They had spent enough time in the properties, holidays, school vacations, the specific luxury of hotel child access that involves understanding every back corridor in which staff members will let you taste test the pastry chef's experiments, to have developed the instinctive relationship with hotel spaces that only comes from inhabiting them rather than visiting them. After everything that happened, after the divorce and the criminal proceedings and the boardroom meeting and the year of reconstruction, I took Oliver and Margot to the Vermont property for a weekend in the autumn. Margot was 10 at the time, Oliver 13, and I had specifically chosen Vermont because it was the property Catherine had said was waiting for us, and because I wanted my grandchildren to experience the thing that had been nearly taken from their family in its most concentrated and characteristic form. The manager, who had known Catherine and who had been briefed on everything that had happened, greeted us at the front door with the specific warmth of someone who has been looking forward to exactly this visit. She had put us in the rooms that had been Catherine's favorites on our previous visits. I had not asked for this and had not expected it, and the gesture, when I understood what it was, cost me a moment of composure that I managed only by looking at the wall of the corridor while I collected myself. I watched my grandchildren discover the building. I watched Oliver find the back staircase that only staff normally used and negotiate permission to use it with a combination of 12-year-old charm and genuine curiosity that reminded me so precisely of his mother at the same age that I had to look away for a moment. I watched Margot sit down in the window seat of the common room with a book and understand, in the way that children understand things they cannot yet articulate, that this was exactly the right place to sit with a book, that the window and the seat and the light were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. After dinner, I sat with both of them in the common room and told them, for the first time in terms appropriate to their ages, what the hotel group was and where it had come from and what their grandmother had meant to its existence. I told them about the $9,000 motel and the 8 rooms and the curtain rod at 1 a.m. I told them about Catherine's standard and what it meant and why it mattered. I told them, in terms that I calibrated to their ages without being condescending, that the property they were sitting in had almost been sold to people who would not have understood what it was, and that their grandmother had prevented that from happening. Oliver asked how she had prevented it if she was already gone. I told him that she had prepared for it before she was gone, that she had thought ahead to what might happen and had put things in place to protect against it, and that this was one of the qualities that had made her one of the most remarkable people I had ever known. He thought about this. She planned for after she was dead? She did, I said. That's pretty impressive, he said, in the specific tone of a 13-year-old for whom impressive is a word reserved for things that genuinely earn it. It was, I said. She was. Margot had been listening with the book still open on her lap, not reading but present. Is that what the hotels are? She asked. Is that what we're keeping? That's exactly what we're keeping, I said. She nodded, and went back to her book, and the fire in the common room grate made the specific sound that fires make in old buildings in the autumn, and I sat with my grandchildren in a place that their grandmother had recognized as waiting for us and that we had nearly lost and had not lost, and the evening was, in the way of evenings that contain both grief and gratitude in equal measure, exactly what it should have been. The morning after the birthday boardroom meeting, I arrived at the flagship hotel at 7 o'clock and went directly to the conference room where the meeting had taken place. The room had been cleaned and reset by the housekeeping staff, who had no knowledge of what had occurred in it the previous day and who had done their work with the same quality of attention that the company's standard required regardless of the significance or insignificance of what any particular room had been used for. The table was polished. The chairs were aligned. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed the morning light coming in at the same angle it had come in for the past 30 years. I sat in the chair at the far end of the table, the chair that had been mine for 3 decades, the one I had occupied yesterday when the meeting opened and from which I had placed the USB drive on the table, and I looked at the chair at the opposite end, the chair where Marcus had sat for the meeting in the suit that announced itself without apology. I sat there for a while. I was not doing anything specific. I was simply being in the room, in the specific way that a person needs to be in a space after something significant has happened in it, to allow the significance to settle into the past tense rather than remaining suspended in the quality of the air. The room felt, after a while, like itself again. A conference room in a hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a polished table and chairs that were well-made and well-maintained, part of a building that had been cared for genuinely for 50 years. Marcus Webb had occupied it briefly and left no permanent mark on it. The work of careful maintenance over half a century is more durable than the work of a 5-year plan, because the careful maintenance is real and the 5-year plan, in his case, was constructed on a foundation of things that were not. I stood up, straightened the chair, and went to my office to begin the day's work. There is something I want to say directly about the specific weapon Marcus chose to deploy against me, because it is not an unusual weapon in the context of this niche of betrayal stories, and because the people who watch this channel deserve to hear it said plainly. The deliberate manufacture of a dementia narrative around an older adult who does not have dementia is one of the most calculated and specifically cruel forms of elder abuse, because it targets not merely the person's finances or property or standing, but their most fundamental personal authority, the authority to be considered a reliable witness to their own experience. If you can convince the people around an older person that this person's mind is failing, you can dismiss everything they say as a symptom of that failure. You can explain away their protests as confusion. You can reframe their accurate observations as delusions. You can use the natural anxieties that families carry about the cognitive decline of aging loved ones, anxieties that are legitimate and that come from real love, as the raw material of a weapon directed at the very person those families love. Marcus was not uniquely sophisticated in having identified this opportunity. The specific cruelty of the approach is that it is not difficult to execute in the early stages, because the behaviors of normal aging, occasional word retrieval difficulty, a repeated story, a confused name, are present in every person over 60 and can be curated and reframed by someone with consistent access to the right rooms and the right audiences. What makes it difficult to sustain, ultimately, is what also makes it temporarily effective. It depends entirely on the constructed narrative rather than the reality. The reality of who a person is, their actual sharpness, their actual engagement with the world, their actual capacity, continues to be visible to anyone who is not already committed to seeing the construction instead. The 4 board members Marcus had installed were people he had selected, at least in part, because they did not know me well enough to have a counter-narrative available. The people who did know me, Thomas Park, Gloria Chen, Richard Holt, the hotel managers I had worked with for decades, did not believe the narrative because they had the reality as a reference point. I was not losing my mind. I have never been sharper in my life than I was in the 6 weeks I spent preparing for that boardroom meeting, because the stakes were clear and the work was concrete, and the combination of those two things is the specific condition under which I have always done my best thinking. The best response to the dementia narrative, I have concluded, is exactly what I did, not to counter it defensively, which validates its premise, but to simply continue being the person you are in front of the people who can see you clearly, and to trust that clarity, over time, to do the work that defensive counterargument cannot. If you are someone who is watching this and who has experienced, or is currently experiencing, a similar manufactured narrative in your own family, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not obligated to debate your own competence with people who have decided to deny it for their own purposes. You are obligated only to continue being clearly and fully yourself, to find the people who can see that clearly, and to build your case from there. The truth has an advantage over the construction. The construction has to be actively maintained. The truth simply continues to be itself. Her name was Alice Bouchard, and she had been managing our Vermont property for 17 years when everything in this story took place. She was 53 years old, a third-generation Vermonter with the particular quality of rootedness that people who have never seriously considered living anywhere else develop without effort, and she had found her way to hotel management through a path that had included a degree in literature, 3 years teaching high school English, and an epiphany in the middle of a winter that the thing she was best at in the world was making people feel welcome in a space, which was not, she had decided, so different from what literature did with minds. She had managed the Vermont property with a combination of absolute rigor about the physical standard of the building and absolute warmth in the personal standard of the guest experience that I had rarely encountered combined so naturally in a single person. The staff she hired and trained and kept were reflections of her own standard, and the guests who returned year after year were testimony to what that standard produced. When I called Alice to tell her, in the final week before the boardroom meeting, that her property had been included in Marcus's preliminary sale discussions, she was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "Mrs. Harmon always said this building wasn't for sale." "It's not," I said. "I know," she said. "It never was. I just wanted you to know she was clear about it." Catherine had spoken with Alice during one of her solo visits to the property, in the months before the stroke. Alice had not told me about this conversation until I called her, because Catherine had not asked her to, and because Alice was a person who understood that the right time for some conversations was determined by the need for them rather than by the passage of time. Catherine had told Alice that the property was the one she would protect most fiercely if she had to choose, and that she wanted Alice to know this in case there came a time when someone tried to suggest otherwise. She had not explained the specific threat she was anticipating. She had simply given Alice her word, the way she had always given her word, quietly, directly, without embellishment, in a form that carried its full weight without needing to announce it. Alice had held that word for 2 years, through Catherine's death and the subsequent months of turbulence. She had not needed to act on it, because I had managed to act on it before the sale discussions got further than the preliminary letter of intent stage. But she had been holding it, ready to speak it plainly to anyone who needed to hear it, including, if it had come to that, the Hospitality Investment Group's representatives. She trusted you, I told Alice, on the phone that final week. She did, Alice said. I hope I was worth it. You were worth every bit of it, I said. On the last day of the year in which all of this concluded, I drove to the cemetery where Catherine was buried and stood for a while at her grave, as I did on the last day of every year, because the ending of a year felt like the right time for the kind of accounting that the company I had spent my life in had always called an annual review. The accounting for this particular year was complicated in both directions: losses that I was still processing and restorations that I was still learning to fully inhabit, a mixture that did not resolve cleanly into either grief or gratitude but existed in the specific emotional territory between them that is sometimes called coming to terms with things. I told her about the boardroom meeting and the recording and Richard Holt and the forensic accountant and Patricia Wells and Thomas Park and Gloria and Diane and Alice. I told her about Oliver asking whether planning for after she was gone was impressive, and Margot asking whether the hotels were what we were keeping. I told her about the Vermont property in autumn and the manager's fireplace and the children who had found, without being told to look for it, the thing that their grandmother had left there. The wind was cold and the light was the specific low winter light of December at this latitude, the same light that had been here a year ago and would be here a year from now and in which I had been making these visits for 2 years now, each one slightly different from the last in what I had to report and what I still needed to understand. You planned better than I did, I said. You always did. I just didn't always know it until the plan was needed. The grave did not respond, which is the way of graves, but the silence had a quality I had come to recognize over 2 years of visits as not empty but simply quiet, the specific quality of quiet that a presence leaves behind. I stood there a while longer. Then I drove home, made coffee in the kitchen of the house we had shared for 40 years, and sat at the table where we had made the decisions that had shaped everything, and I drank it slowly, looking out the window at the yard in the winter light. The hotels were full. The standard was intact. The year was ending. I was still here, and I was still building, and the standard was still what it had always been: care for the people who come through your doors, genuinely and completely, and they will know they were welcomed, and they will come back, and what you have built will be worth coming back to. That is the ending. That is also the beginning of the next year, the next part of the building, the next morning of honest work. That is what the steady father knows. The reconstituted board of the Harmon Hotel Group held its first full meeting 6 weeks after the birthday boardroom confrontation, in the same conference room with the floor-to-ceiling windows, which I had specifically chosen because I believed, and still believe, that rooms are not defined by the worst things that happen in them but by all the things that happen in them, and that the first full meeting of the new board was the appropriate way to begin redeeming that particular space. I sat at the head of the table, in the chair that was mine, and I looked around at the people who had chosen to be there: Diane to my right, Thomas Park 2 chairs down, Gloria Chin in the observer's seat she had occupied for 22 years, Evelyn Moore from the Chicago property, and 3 other board members whose tenures predated Marcus's arrival and who had been, during the preceding 18 months, quietly uncomfortable with the direction of board discussions without having had the Specific information needed to articulate why. What struck me, looking at those faces, was something Catherine had said many years earlier when we had restructured the board during a period of growth, that the quality of a company's governance was visible in the quality of the people who showed up to govern it, and that a board that had the right people was more valuable than a board that had the right structure, because structure can be created but people cannot be manufactured. These were the right people. They had been there all along, actually, present in the company, patient with the turbulence of the preceding 5 years, ready to do the work of the company's governance when the governance was offered to them clearly rather than managed around them. I had underestimated, during the years of Marcus's positioning, the degree to which the people who understood the company were simply waiting for the clarity that the situation had not yet provided. The first meeting was businesslike in the best sense, focused, specific, free of the studied vagueness that had characterized board meetings under Marcus's influence, during which he had consistently moved discussions toward generality at the moments when specificity might have revealed the gap between his strategic presentations and the operational reality. We talked about specific properties and specific maintenance needs and specific staffing situations and specific market opportunities, in the direct and detailed manner of people who know what they are talking about and are not managing how that knowledge is perceived. Diane contributed twice, both times with the specific precision I had been watching return to her over the preceding months, observations about our younger guest demographics and their changing preferences that were informed by her own experience as a guest and her recent conversations with our hotel managers, and that were offered not as strategic frameworks but as concrete observations with concrete implications. Both contributions were good. Both were received as the good contributions they were, without the performative enthusiasm or the subtle reframing that had characterized Marcus's reception of any contribution that was not his own. After the meeting, I walked through the lobby with Gloria, who was doing her own daily review of the Standard, and she said, "It feels like the company again." "It is the company again," I said. "It always was," she said. "It just had a lot of noise over it for a while." That was, I thought, the most accurate description of the preceding 5 years that I had yet encountered. The company had always been what it was. The noise of Marcus's positioning had obscured it without changing it, the way weather obscures a landscape without altering its topography. When the noise cleared, the landscape was exactly as it had been, waiting for the people who understood it to return to the work of tending it. On what would have been my and Catherine's 49th wedding anniversary, I went back to the Methodist Church in rural North Carolina where we had been married in 1973. I had not been there since the wedding itself, which had been 50 years earlier to the spring, and I was not certain, driving up in the early morning, what I expected to find. What I found was a building that had been well maintained in the specific way of small community churches whose congregations take their stewardship of the space seriously, neither dramatically updated nor allowed to deteriorate, occupying the same position in the same landscape with the same quality of simple, honest presence it had occupied when we made our promises in it. I sat in the same pew, as nearly as I could reconstruct it, where the guests had sat. I looked at the front of the church where we had stood. I thought about being 24 years old and having almost nothing and being entirely certain, in the specific certainty that youth occasionally gets right, that the woman beside me was the person who would make everything I built worth building. I had been right. I was right in a way I could not have fully understood at 24, because at 24 I had not yet built anything significant and had not yet experienced the specific quality of building alongside someone whose contribution is so deeply integrated with your own that the distinction between what you made and what they made is not visible from inside the work. I had not yet understood that the hotels were as much Catherine as they were me, not in the legal ownership sense but in the more fundamental sense of what they actually were, that her standard was in every one of them as surely as my construction decisions were, that the two of us had built something that neither of us could have built alone. At 71 years old, sitting in a rural North Carolina church on a spring morning, I understood this completely. I had understood it for a long time, actually, but understanding a thing intellectually and experiencing its full weight are different levels of the same truth, and the full weight of it was there that morning in that pew. I sat for a while. Then I drove back to the city and went to the flagship hotel and walked through the lobby and saw that it was well and went to my office and began the day's work, because that is what Catherine would have done, and it is what I do, and the doing of it is the most faithful form of the anniversary I know how to observe. 6 months after the Vermont visit, I built Margot a desk. She had mentioned, during the visit, that she needed a desk, not insisted on it, not requested it specifically, simply mentioned it in the offhand way that 12-year-olds mention things, with no expectation that the mention would be acted upon by anyone in particular. I had noted it at the time without making any commitment, and I had returned to it over the subsequent weeks in my workshop, thinking about what kind of desk a 12-year-old who read books in window seats would want and use and grow into over the next decade. I built it from white oak, the same species I have worked with throughout my career in wood, because white oak has a quality of durability and dignity that seems appropriate for furniture that is meant to last. I built it with a design that had grown from the proportions I had measured from Margot's room on the Vermont visit, the window seat height, the natural writing position of a 12-year-old, the space she would need as she grew, so that the desk would fit her room and her height, and the specific quality of focused stillness that I had watched her bring to reading. I built it over 4 Saturdays in my workshop, working in the early mornings before the rest of the day's obligations, in the specific quality of absorbed attention that woodworking demands, and that has always been, for me, the most complete form of rest available. Not the absence of engagement but the presence of engagement that is entirely physical and immediate and that leaves no room for anything else. I delivered it on a Sunday afternoon. Margot watched it be carried into her room and installed at the angle we had agreed upon in advance, facing the window, with the particular relationship between desk surface and window frame that allows a person to look up from what they are writing and see exactly as much sky as is good for thinking. She sat down at it immediately. She opened her notebook. She wrote something, looked out the window, wrote something else. I watched this from the doorway for a moment. Then I walked back down the hall, because the desk was doing what it was supposed to do and my presence was no longer required. That is the test of built things, really. When they are doing what they were built to do, they do not need to be watched. They simply work, quietly and continuously, holding what was put into them without needing acknowledgement. The desk will hold. The hotels will hold. The standard will hold. The things that are built honestly, from good materials, with full attention to what they are meant to do, these things hold. That is what I have built my life on understanding. That is the steady father. I want to describe in some detail exactly how Marcus operated within the company, because I think the mechanics of what he did are more instructive than the bare fact of it, and because the people who watch this channel deserve more than a story, they deserve the specific understanding of how a person like Marcus works, so that they can recognize it earlier than I did. Marcus operated primarily through a mechanism I have come to think of as strategic reframing. He did not invent false information, at least not initially. He took accurate information and placed it in a context that altered its meaning without technically falsifying its content. When I redirected one of his strategic analyses in a board meeting, pointing out, gently and without drawing particular attention to it, that his projected returns on a renovation project were based on occupancy assumptions that our historical data did not support, Marcus did not argue with the correction. He accepted it, graciously, in the room. But in the private conversation he subsequently had with 2 board members over dinner, he framed that same exchange as Ed second-guessing the numbers without a clear alternative framework, which has been happening more frequently lately and seems to reflect some difficulty tracking complex projections in real time. The correction I had offered had been accurate. The reframing was not a fabrication of the correction but a fabrication of its cause. He had taken a legitimate professional disagreement and retroactively assigned it a medical explanation. By doing this consistently, across enough private conversations with enough board members, he built a narrative that had the specific advantage of appearing to be corroborated by actual events that had actually occurred, but that meant something entirely different from what he told people they meant. This is the particular sophistication of the approach, and it is why it is difficult to counter. If Marcus had fabricated incidents that had not occurred, the fabrications would have been disprovable by the people who had been present and had witnessed something different. But because the incidents he cited were real incidents, the reframing could only be countered by an alternative interpretation of events that people had already processed through his framing, a significantly harder task. The counter to it, ultimately, was not refutation but recording. The recording I played in the boardroom did not disprove any specific claim Marcus had made. It did something more effective. It made visible the intention behind the claims, the deliberate constructedness of the narrative, the gap between what he was telling people in private and what he understood to be true when he thought no one was watching. Intention is the thing that changes everything. The same behavior, understood as genuine concern versus understood as strategic manipulation, is a completely different thing, and the recording made the understanding irreversible. 3 days after the boardroom meeting, before any public statement was made about the criminal investigation or the management changes, I held a meeting with every staff member at the flagship property who was on duty that morning. I did not require attendance. This was a meeting, not a mandatory briefing, and every single person who was on shift came. I stood at the front of the lobby, which was the largest gathering space we had without moving to a conference room, and I told them the following: that there had been a period of disruption in the company's management, and that the disruption was over. That certain financial irregularities had been identified and were being addressed through appropriate legal channels. That the company's ownership and governance were fully restored to the family that had built the company, and that the standard of hospitality that the company had maintained for 50 years would be maintained going forward without interruption or compromise. I did not use Marcus's name. I did not characterize what had happened in terms that invited questions I was not yet in a position to answer fully. I told the truth at the level of specificity that the moment required, which is the level I have always tried to operate at in communications with the people who do the actual work of the hotels. At the end of the brief statement, I said, "I want to thank you for continuing to do your jobs at the standard this company requires, throughout a period that I know created uncertainty. The guests who came through these doors in the past 18 months received the welcome they deserved because you provided it regardless of what was happening in the executive offices. That is the standard, and you maintained it, and I am grateful." Gloria was in the back of the lobby during this, as she had been in the back of the boardroom as a witness, and when I caught her eye after the statement she gave me a small nod that said everything her professional composure was not going to say out loud. The staff returned to their work. The lobby performed its function. The guests arrived and were welcomed and could not know from anything they observed, that 2 weeks earlier the building they were standing in had been 3 signatures away from being sold to people who would not have understood what it was. That is what a standard does when it has been properly built. It keeps operating even when the people responsible for it at the executive level are failing it. The staff of our hotels had kept the standard through 5 years of executive turbulence because the standard had been installed in them by Catherine and by the managers she had trained and by the 22 years of Gloria Chen's daily demonstration of what it actually looked like. It did not require me to keep it going. It required me only to restore the conditions that allowed the people who carried it to do so without the friction of an executive layer that was working against it. They had kept it. I had restored the conditions. The standard was intact. I had lunch with Richard Holt 4 months after the birthday boardroom meeting, in a restaurant he chose near his office, and during the lunch he said something that I have thought about many times since. We had been talking about the case, the criminal proceedings, the civil settlement, the reconstituted board, the status of the Vermont property, in the relaxed manner of people who have worked through something together and are now on the other side of it, when Richard paused over his coffee and said, "I want to ask you something that isn't entirely professional." "Go ahead," I said. "When you watched the recording for the first time, the full 94 minutes, what did you feel? Not what you thought. What you felt." I considered this for a moment. "Mostly cold," I said. "The way you feel when something dangerous that you suspected was nearby turns out to be closer than you realized." Not surprised, I had already known enough to be prepared for something significant. But the proximity of it, when it was visible clearly, was different from knowing it abstractly. And about Marcus specifically, he asked. I felt something for Diane, I said. Not about Marcus, about Diane. The part where he described managing her. That was the part that was hardest. Richard nodded. But you kept it separate from the legal work. I had to, I said. The two things were equally real and I needed to handle the legal work cleanly. The feeling about Diane was something I had to carry separately until the legal work was done, and then address directly with her, which I did. Most people in your situation, Richard said carefully, would have made the feeling the primary thing and let it drive the approach. The meeting would have been a confrontation rather than a controlled revelation. A confrontation would have given Marcus something to defend against, I said. A controlled revelation gave him nothing. The recording speaks clearly enough that my emotional state in the room was irrelevant. I only needed to be steady enough to press play. Richard was quiet for a moment. Your wife trained you for that, he said. Not specifically for this situation, but for the general principle of it. She did, I said. Over 48 years of building things together, yes. She trained me for exactly this, without either of us knowing that's what was happening. He raised his coffee cup in a small, informal gesture. Then here's to her, he said. To Catherine, I agreed. We drank our coffee, and the restaurant continued around us, and the city continued outside, and the Standard continued in 14 hotels across 7 states, and everything that mattered was where it belonged. On a morning in late autumn, the first one cold enough to require the small heater I kept in my workshop for the winter months, I went to the workbench before the sun had fully risen and stood in the particular darkness of a space illuminated only by the single work light above the bench. I had finished the desk for Margot. I had completed a small repair on a chair from the Vermont Properties common room, a joint that had loosened with the natural movement of old wood and seasonal temperature changes, a repair that required only patience and the right adhesive and the understanding that old wood is not failing when it moves but simply expressing the accumulated experience of its years. The chair would hold better now than it had before the joint needed attention. Good repair is not restoration to a prior state. It is improvement over that prior state, because you understand more about the piece now than you did when it was new. I stood at the bench in the early morning darkness and did something I had not done in several months, which was nothing. Not planning. Not reviewing. Not running calculations or preparing for a meeting or thinking through a decision. Simply standing in the workshop, in the dark, with the tools on their hooks and the smell of wood and oil and the small sounds of a well-maintained space that knows it is cared for. I was 71 years old. I had built things for 50 years. I had survived 2 threats to the buildings in the preceding 2 years, one medical, one criminal, and come through both of them with the company intact and the Standard preserved and the people who mattered to me in reasonable shape, all things considered. I thought about the $9,000 motel. I thought about Catherine at the front desk of someone else's hotel, understanding already what the things she was working toward would need to be. I thought about the fold-out card table and the lamp and the careful book she had kept by lamplight in the first renovation. I thought about the curtain rod at 1 in the morning in room 7, the 2 of us on the step ladder, standing back to confirm it was straight. It was straight. Everything we had built was straight, in the sense that matters, built to plumb, built to level, built from true. Not perfect, because nothing built by people is perfect. But honest, which is the quality that allows imperfect things to hold. The workshop held the darkness and the silence for a while longer. Then the sun came up, and the light changed, and I picked up the plane from the bench and looked for something worth working on. There was always something worth working on. There always will be. The steady father keeps building. Over 50 years of operating the Harmon Hotel Group, certain guests had become as much a part of the company's story as the properties themselves. Not famous guests, we had hosted some of those over the years, but they were never the guests that mattered most to the company's identity. The guests that mattered most were the ordinary ones, the couple who came to the Vermont property every autumn for their anniversary, for 17 consecutive years, because Catherine had remembered, on their third visit, that they had mentioned celebrating their anniversary there the first time and had quietly ensured that the same room was available for every subsequent visit without being asked. The traveling nurse who stayed at our Chicago property for 6 months during a contract rotation and who had told Evelyn, on her last morning, that it was the first time in 4 years of traveling for work that she had felt she was staying somewhere rather than merely sleeping somewhere. The retired teacher from the Pacific Northwest who had checked into our flagship hotel during a cross-country trip with his wife in 1989 and who had continued to stay there every 2 years on his way to visiting their children, who had moved east, until he was 81 years old and the visits had stopped, and whose name Gloria still knew without looking it up. None of these guests had any idea that they were, collectively, the point. They came because the welcome was genuine and the standard was maintained and the buildings were cared for honestly, and they did not need to understand why these things were true in order to benefit from them. The reason they were true was not their concern. The reason they were true was Catherine's standard, installed in 50 years of hiring decisions and management priorities and the specific quality of attention that a founder-led company gives to the things the founder actually cares about. The reason Marcus's plan had been so specifically destructive was that he had understood the hotels as real estate and revenue and brand, which are all real things, but had not understood them as people, as the accumulated relationships between specific humans in specific places, built over decades of genuine attention, constituting something that had no line item in a financial model because it could not be assigned a dollar value that would mean anything. A hospitality investment group can buy a hotel. It cannot buy the relationship between Gloria Chen and the guests who have checked into the flagship property for 15, 20, 25 years. It cannot buy the relationship between Alice Bouchard and the building she has managed for 17 years with the understanding that the building is doing something that deserves to be supported rather than merely maintained. It cannot buy the understanding of what a guest who has been traveling since early morning needs before they need to articulate it. These things cannot be acquired. They can only be built, over time, by people who care about building them, in organizations that give them the resources and the stability and the sustained standard to do so. This is what we defended. This is what Catherine's gift protected. This is what the steady father means, in the specific context of this story, not the defense of property or revenue or ownership, but the defense of something made from genuine attention over a long time, something that holds up under pressure because it was built from real materials by honest hands. 6 months after everything was resolved, Diane came to my house on a Saturday morning, which had not been a habit of hers before everything happened but which had, in the aftermath, become a regular occurrence, one Saturday a month, specifically, at 10 o'clock, with the consistency of a scheduled appointment even though neither of us had formally scheduled it. She brought coffee from the bakery 2 blocks away, which made better coffee than I made myself and which she had begun to bring on these visits as her specific contribution to the morning. We sat at the kitchen table, which was Catherine's table, which Diane had grown up eating at and which had the accumulated quality of a surface that has held many years of honest conversation. We talked about the company, mostly. It was the thing we had most in common now in a direct, daily sense, and talking about it was the easiest way to be together while the deeper layers of things settled at their own pace. We talked about the property review I had done the previous week, and about a hiring situation Evelyn was navigating in Chicago, and about the conversation Diane had had with the architect on the Pacific Northwest renovation, which was proceeding well. At some point in the middle of a conversation about the renovation timeline, Diane stopped and said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," I said. "I was angry at you for a while," she said. "After the boardroom." "Not at Marcus," I processed that separately. "But at you. I was angry that you didn't tell me sooner. That you waited until 4 days before the meeting, and I had to go into that room with only 4 days of preparation. I had known this. Not from anything she had said directly, but from the quality of our early interactions after the meeting, which had been careful in a way that I recognized as the carefulness of a person managing something they were not yet ready to address. "That's fair," I said. "I know you had reasons," she said. "I know Richard Holt advised it. I understand the tactical logic. I'm not saying you were wrong, I'm saying I was angry anyway, and I wanted you to know that." "Thank you for telling me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would have told me sooner," she said. "She would have found a way to tell me that didn't compromise the case." "She probably would have," I agreed. "She was better at that than I am. She understood how to give people what they needed to know while protecting what they needed not to know yet. I'm more blunt. I either tell everything or nothing, and nothing seemed safer." "Nothing wasn't safer for me," she said. "No," I said. "It wasn't. I'm sorry." She picked up her coffee. "Okay," she said. "That's what I needed." We went back to talking about the renovation timeline. The mourning continued in the specific way of mournings between a father and a daughter who were rebuilding a relationship that had been used against them both and who were doing it the way people rebuild things that were built honestly in the first place, carefully, from the existing foundation, trusting the original structure to hold what is placed on top of it. The foundation held. It held because it had been built honestly, by two people who had put everything real they had into making it, and because what is built honestly does not stop being itself even when things are placed on top of it that try to obscure it. That is what I know. That is the steady father. Keep the standard. Don't let anyone take what we built. I haven't. I won't. She wouldn't have either. When Richard Holt's team investigated Marcus Webb's professional background in full, what they found was a comprehensive architecture of constructed identity that had been built over approximately 15 years with considerable care and some genuine cleverness. The MBA was, as I had suspected, from an institution that existed primarily to sell credentials to people who needed a line on a resume rather than an education. Marcus had attended the institution's online program while working a series of hospitality industry jobs that were considerably more junior than his subsequent self-description implied: front desk positions, night audit roles, a brief stint in food and beverage operations at a mid-range hotel chain. None of these were shameful positions. They were honest work in the industry. The shame was in what he had done with them subsequently, transformed them, through the careful application of executive vocabulary and selective emphasis, into a consulting background that sounded like senior leadership and looked, in the absence of specific verification, like the foundation of a legitimate career. The consulting engagements he had described with several notable Northeast hotel groups were, as my own discreet inquiries had suggested years earlier, significantly more peripheral than his description implied. In two cases he had been engaged as a contractor for specific short-term projects rather than in any ongoing advisory capacity. In one case the engagement had been, as best Richard's investigators could determine, entirely apocryphal, a company name on his resume that represented an organization he had had contact with but never formally worked for. He had been, in the most fundamental sense, performing a version of himself that did not exist, for long enough into enough people that the performance had accumulated its own apparent corroboration. In a specific social ecosystem of the hospitality industry, where professionals move between organizations and relationships are maintained over careers, a person who presents credibly enough in direct interaction and whose resume is not actively verified will accumulate the associations that make verification seem unnecessary. Marcus had understood this and had exploited it with the patience and the specific social fluency that were, genuinely, his most notable actual skills. He was not stupid. I want to be clear about that, because dismissing him as simply a fraud misses the genuine capability he possessed. He was a person with real social intelligence and real observational skills who had directed those capabilities entirely toward the construction and maintenance of a false identity rather than toward the development of an actual one. The effort he had put into becoming Marcus Webb, hospitality strategist, was considerable. The tragedy of it, and I do find something tragic in it, which is not the same as finding it sympathetic, is that the same effort directed honestly might have produced something real. It did not. He chose the construction. The construction ultimately collapsed, as all constructions built on false foundations must, when sufficient pressure was applied to the right load-bearing wall. Catherine had been the load-bearing wall. She had been it in our company and in our family and in the 48 years of a life built beside mine, and she had remained it even after she was gone, in the form of a USB drive and a sealed envelope and an amendment to an estate document that a second attorney had prepared and held and delivered at exactly the right moment. The construction collapsed. The foundation held. The standard remained. That is the story. That is the steady father. My 72nd birthday fell on a Thursday morning, which meant that by the time I arrived at the flagship hotel for the day's work, Gloria was already at the front desk and the breakfast service was in full operation and the building was doing exactly what it had been built to do for 50 years. I had specifically not scheduled any meetings for the morning, which was unusual for me but which had seemed, given the previous year's experience of the date, like a reasonable accommodation. I wanted the morning to be ordinary in the way that a year of restoration had made the company's ordinary mornings feel again, full of specific, concrete work, free of the strategic undercurrent that had made every meeting for 5 years feel like it was also about something other than what it was ostensibly about. Diane called at 9. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said. "How does it feel?" "Quieter than last year," I said. She laughed, which was the laugh I had been hearing my whole life, and that was entirely her own, not performed for anyone's benefit, simply the sound of a person finding something genuinely funny. "That's a low bar," she said. "Appropriately low for where we were," I said. "We're somewhere different now," she said. "We are," I agreed. She had sent flowers to the hotel, which I found on my desk when I arrived, not elaborate, not expensive, the specific kind of arrangement that Catherine had always preferred and that Diane had, over the preceding months, quietly adopted as her own vocabulary in the language of flowers. They were in the vase that Catherine had kept on my desk for 30 years, which I had kept there after her death and which no one had ever moved. I sat at my desk on my 72nd birthday, in the office where I had spent 30 years of mornings, with the flowers in Catherine's vase and the company restored and Diane on the board and the standard intact and the Vermont property full and the new Pacific Northwest property in renovation and the granddaughter's desk in use in her room and the piece of white oak on the bench in my workshop and Richard Holt's card in my Rolodex and Walter Harris's number in my phone and Gloria Chinat. The front desk of the lobby below me and 50 years of honest work visible in 14 hotels across 7 states. I had everything I needed. I had, in fact, everything. "Keep building." She said so. A father built it piece by piece, from nothing, and from will he poured it into buildings that are standing steady still. His wife stood at his shoulder through the decades of the work and she left behind a weapon for the danger and the murk. They thought an old man's memory would make him easy prey. They thought if they said often enough, the world would start to sway. They didn't know his wife had seen it coming years before and left a recording waiting, just behind a hidden door. The steady father doesn't rage, he doesn't break and run. He gathers all his evidence until the work is done, and when he walks into the room, he doesn't need to speak. He presses play, and lets the truth destroy what liars seek. So here's to all the steady ones who built without applause, who held the line for decades without anyone who saw, who kept the standard burning when the easy path was out. The steady father always finds what real love is about. It's not the money in the buildings, not the name upon the wall. It's the person who stayed with you, who carried when you'd fall. It's the recording left behind to give you what you need. The steady father's greatest gift is love that plants the seed. Keep the standard. Keep on building. She said so. And she was never wrong. A year after everything concluded, my mornings had returned to the shape they had held for most of my adult life, with the small modifications that 72 years and a significant cardiac event and the events of the preceding 2 years had introduced. I woke at 5:30. I made coffee in the kitchen that still held every choice Catherine had made in it, from the cabinet hardware to the window over the sink through which I could see the yard in whatever season it was presenting. I drank the coffee at the table. I went to the workshop. The workshop had 2 projects running simultaneously, which was more than I usually maintained, but which the preceding period of forced slowdown had left me with enough accumulated project ideas to justify. I was building a small cabinet for the Vermont Properties common room, to replace one that had deteriorated beyond economical repair, and I was working on a personal project that had no deadline and no audience and no practical purpose beyond being the kind of project that keeps a man's hands honest. A writing desk for my own use, built from a piece of figured walnut I had been holding for 3 years because the right project had not yet presented itself. The walnut was remarkable material. Figured walnut has a grain that moves in ways that straight-grained wood does not, catching light differently from different angles, requiring the specific attention and the willingness to work with rather than against the material's own character. It was the kind of wood that rewarded slowness and patience and the willingness to let the building tell you what it needed to become rather than imposing a predetermined form on it. I worked on the desk in the mornings, in the early light before the rest of the day's obligations called for my attention. I worked on it slowly, which is the only way to work on figured walnut if you want the result to be what the material deserves. I did not have a specific completion date in mind, because a desk built for my own use could be finished when it was finished and not before, and rushing it would only produce a desk that was technically complete and aesthetically wrong. This is the lesson that everything in the preceding 2 years had confirmed in the most emphatic possible terms. The things worth building take the time they take, and the things built to a timeline external to their own natural development are the things that reveal their shortcuts when pressure is applied to them. Marcus had been in a hurry. 5 years had seemed long to him, long enough to lose patience with the careful pace of legitimate building and to begin seeking shortcuts that would achieve in a single boardroom meeting what the building of genuine competence and genuine trust would have required years more to accomplish. The shortcuts had seemed, from inside the plan, to be working. They were not working. They were simply accumulating the specific debt that all shortcuts accumulate, visible only when the structure they are holding up is tested. I was not in a hurry. I had not been in a hurry for 50 years. The hotels I had built took the time they took, and the ones that were 30 and 40 years old were the ones that had become what their locations allowed them to become, in the slow and patient way of things allowed to develop according to their own nature rather than forced into shapes determined by external timelines. The walnut desk would be finished when the walnut told me it was ready. The Harmon Hotel Group would continue its slow, patient growth in the direction that the company's own nature, the standard Catherine had articulated and that had been operating continuously for 50 years, indicated. Diane would find her footing in the company at the pace her own development required. My grandchildren would grow up in the hotels the way their mother had, and would understand them in the way that only inhabitation teaches, and would carry forward, in their own time and their own way, whatever of the standard they were capable of carrying. That is all any of us can do. Build honestly, maintain the standard, pass it forward to the people who come after us, and trust that what is genuinely built will genuinely last. The steady father has always known this. He has known it from the first row house, in the first hotel, in the first morning back after the surgery, in the boardroom with the recording, in the Saturday morning visits to the cemetery, in the workshop in the early light. He knows it now. He will keep building until he can't, and then the buildings will speak for him. That is enough. That is everything. On a Friday afternoon in the spring following everything, Gloria Chen stopped by my office at the end of her shift, which was not her habit. Gloria was a person who maintained the professional boundaries of her role with the same clarity she maintained everything else, and drop-ins were not consistent with that clarity, which meant when she made one it carried the specific weight of something she had decided needed to be said in person rather than addressed through the normal channels. She sat in the chair across from my desk and said, "I want to tell you something I've been holding since Mrs. Harmon died." "Please," I said. "She came to see me about 3 months before the end," Gloria said. "She came to the hotel specifically to see me, not on any other business. She sat in this office, you weren't here, and she talked to me for almost an hour about the company and what she hoped it would be and what she was worried about. And at the end, she said something I've been trying to decide what to do with ever since. She paused. She said, "Gloria, Ed is going to need the hotels to be exactly what they are. Not what Marcus thinks they should be, and not what a new owner would make them into. Exactly what they are. Can you keep them exactly what they are until he finds his footing again?" I sat with that for a moment. She knew, I said. How long had she known? Long enough, Gloria said. She didn't tell me specifically. She just asked me to keep the standard until you were ready to lead it again yourself. Those were her words. Until you were ready to lead it again yourself. She thought I'd lost the thread, I said. I think she thought the thread was being pulled from you, Gloria said carefully. And that you hadn't fully noticed yet. And that she was leaving before she could point it out to you directly. I looked at the window, at the city outside it, at the building across the street that I had watched from this same window for 30 years as it changed and was renovated and changed again. She trusted you to hold it, I said. She trusted the standard, Gloria said. I was just the person she thought was most committed to it. You were right, I said. You kept it for 5 years in conditions that made it difficult. The standard is what it is now partly because of that. Gloria stood up, smoothing the jacket she wore in the specific way she always wore it at the end of a long day. She also said one more thing, she said, at the door. What? She said, he always gets there eventually. Just needs more time than I do. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling and allowed myself, in the privacy of my own office at the end of a long day, to find that genuinely funny. Because it was true. Because it had always been true. Because 48 years of building something together had never changed the fundamental fact that she had always gotten there first and had waited, with that particular patience she had for the things that mattered, for me to catch up. That sounds right, I said. Gloria smiled, the specific smile she reserved for moments that were too significant for professional composure but too dignified for anything more demonstrative, and said good night, and left. I sat in my office in the last light of a spring afternoon for a while, thinking about Catherine at 22 at a hotel front desk she hadn't yet left, already knowing what the standard needed to be, already understanding that the thing worth building was the real thing rather than the approximation of it, already prepared to wait as long as it took for the person beside her to get there too. I had gotten there. It had taken me until I was 71 years old and had nearly lost everything we built together to get there fully, but I had gotten there. And the standard was intact. And the hotels were full. And the work continued. And that, as Catherine would have said with the specific precision that said everything in the fewest possible words, was exactly what it needed to be.